Good evening. Thanks for inviting me here to DePaul University. I really appreciate it. I do tax policy for a living pretty much. I'm happy to be invited almost anywhere, really. No one likes to talk about taxes. My organization is a bipartisan group. We're not nonpartisan, we're bipartisan. That means my board of directors has prominent Democrats and Republicans who neither really like or trust each other very much. And that's great for the group, because it allows us to focus on data and best practices. And frankly, we don't care about the ideological viewpoint of a specific initiative. We don't care at all. We don't care if it's liberal. We don't care if it's conservative. We don't even ask the question. If it comports with the data, if it meets demographically driven needs, if it's best practice, we support it. If it misses the boat on those things, we don't. Now, you mentioned, Diane, the Education Commission I just served on at the federal level, and this is our specific charge that we were given by the President and the Department of Education. We were to look at the disparities in meaningful educational opportunities that give rise to the achievement gap with a focus on finance. We were specifically asked to look at how finance related to opportunity. I know you've all heard the canard, money doesn't matter in education, it's all about family, it's all about this. Well, the data tell us something very different indeed. And in fact, money does very much matter. Now, why would this be the charge? And when we started digging into the data, one thing we learned right away is that the overall public education system in America is not broken for all kids, but it's very much under-resourced if we wanted to get every child in America a meaningful educational opportunity. Let's look at those test scores that America achieves when competing internationally with other OECD nations on PISA. This is the big benchmark everybody looks at. And overall, US scores were Midland, right? Around 500 when the OECD average was 493. You know, we have this nation that believes in American exceptionalism. Midland isn't exactly where we want to be coming out. In math, frankly, we are below most other OECD nations. In fact, we rank 27th in math scores. But that's overall. Once you adjust for poverty, American results on the PISA exams look quite different. In fact, for those school districts in America with 0 to 10% poverty, they scored highest in PISA exams combined in the world. Higher than all these other nations we envy, Finland, and et cetera, right? Then when you go to that next cut on poverty, basically the 10 to 25% level, fourth highest in the world overall, and in fact highest when you compare us to any other nation with a similar poverty demographic. American scores on the PISA exams didn't fall off the map until poverty got up to 25% or greater. Then our scores plummeted. Now, interestingly enough, if you map out the resources being invested in public education in those communities in America with less than 25% poverty versus those communities in America with more than 25% poverty, you see significantly being more spent per pupil in the high income areas, low poverty areas than we spend on our poor kids. Now that's a challenge when you look at the demographics of a state like Illinois, where roughly 44% of the children in our public education system come from a low income background. You go to CPS, the number approaches 88%. Poverty becomes a real obstacle in educating a child at 25%. If you want to know overall comparisons, really, our poverty rate in America is twice the OECD average for children, and we have a higher poverty rate for children than any other industrialized nation in Europe or Asia or North America. So it seems that the focus of this commission, poverty and insufficient resources inequitably distributed, was right on point. And we have to look at this issue of how we're financing our public education system and what kind of opportunity we're actually creating for children across the nation. Now, question for the audience. This is not a new sort of epiphany for American education public. Do you know who first noted these very core issues, the correlation between underfunding, inequity, and education in America? Do you know who did first? Who? No. President Nixon. and the Nixon Commission in 1972. In fact, the Nixon Commission specifically made 3 findings which are true today. Our Equity and Excellence Commission made the exact same findings. You could read our report for each and every child that's available online. Number 1, education funding, especially at the state level, is way too tied to local property taxes. That's a problem. Number 2, it's part of that first one, education funding rarely takes into account the actual cost of educating children. In Illinois, what we do is what most states do. The General Assembly gets together and says, gee, what could the state afford per kid? That's our starting point for education funding. It has nothing to do with the actual cost of hiring teachers, putting technology in the classroom, or frankly, anything else in the field of public education. Second, Nixon found money can actually help solve a number of these problems. Nixon, right? Not some left-wing liberal, Richard Milhouse Nixon. He also found that states have the primary responsibility to deal with this issue, to create an adequate funding system, adequate level, sustainable, fairly funded, et cetera. But Nixon made an interesting point. The Nixon Commission specifically found that if the states demonstrate they lack either the political will or the fiscal capacity to create the kind of educational system that provides a real opportunity for all kids to learn, then it's incumbent on the federal government to step in, because this is a national issue. It is not a local issue. And it's a national issue because of the correlations between educational attainment and economic viability in the current world, in the global economy in which we live. So the solution, of course, very simple: build capacity. Take an evidence-based approach. Evidence-based approach to education funding is a real simple thing. Pioneered by Alan Odden at the University of Wisconsin. You look at those practices, whether they're instructional, pedagogical, technological, et cetera, that actually have a statistically significant correlation to improving student achievement over time. And you base your funding on that. It's what you want to do. You want to look at funding what actually reaches kids and helps them learn. That's the evidence-based model. It's not a lot of rocket science there. You want to bridge rather than reinforce ideological divides. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the partisan nature of the rhetoric on everything from tax policy to education policy is somewhat charged. It's also very counterproductive. It gets in the way of moving forward on an intelligent basis. You want to minimize inefficient competition. Now, this is a really important one. I mean, I know there's a lot of people who believe that competition will somehow make the public education system better. Let's talk about that from a theoretical standpoint. What is the biggest or most central underpinning of a competitive model? There has to be a winner and a loser. Is that really the model you want for public education? Do you want schools that are losers? Do you want children attending losing schools? Or is the model something different than that? Rather than competing, shouldn't we be collaborating, focusing on best practices, implementing best practices, so that every school district in America provides a really good education to the children going through its doors? That's the goal. Competition on something like public education cannot work because the model itself is inappropriate for public education. And then, of course, once you've decided, okay, here's our evidence-based practices that we really should be funding, we're going to, encourage collaboration, all that stuff, you need the money to fund it. And you need the money to be raised on a sustainable basis. Now, unfortunately, that building capacity collaborative model is not the model to education reform that is dominant in America. America is one of a number of nations that has been infected with what Pasi Sahlberg from Finland, the education minister of Finland, calls the GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement. Under this movement, certain approaches to reforming public education systems have been implemented. Number one, set higher standards. We need high standards. We need the kids to achieve at these levels or those levels. Query, do you think setting a standard without funding the inputs necessary to meet those standards is in any way meaningful? We don't like to talk about the funding part. We're happy to set higher standards, but we've never funded them. Number two, standardize education. Three, enhance those accountability metrics. Fire those bad teachers. We had Pasi Sahlberg come here from Finland and talk about public education in his nation and how they turned it around. And one of the things he was asked from the audience was, well, how do you get rid of your bad teachers? He kind of looked funny, and he said, in Finland, we don't have bad teachers. All our teachers are good. And when you look at the data, the highest paid profession in Finland, teaching. Hardest occupation to get into in Finland, teaching. Most rigorous academic program through university and grad school, teaching. All of the Finnish teachers come from the top 5% of their graduating class. America, 30% of our teachers come from the top. The rest come from the bottom. In America, according to the Wall Street Journal, teaching is the lowest paid profession for equal amounts of qualification. We ask these teachers to get masters, we ask them to get degrees, and then we don't pay them for it. A little different model. So, enhance accountability metrics, and then, of course, enhance competition. Here are the nations that got infected with the germ, and I stole this directly from Pasi. He made this presentation in Chicago a year ago. USA, UK, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. And these were their math scores on PISA in 2000, the year they really started approaching the reform effort, focusing on accountability, focusing on competition, all these things. And every single nation saw their math scores decline in the 10-year sequence between when they started this movement and where they got to. Now, why isolate math? Because math is more reliant on the educational system than reading for student outcomes. Most kids don't get much math help at home. Most kids get some help, at least, on reading and those kinds of things. So in the most education-focused metric, every nation that adopted this approach that America is following right now on reforming its education system, high-end accountability, blah, 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 has seen its math scores decline on PISA. And then there's Finland, which of course rejected that model, built collaboration, built capacity, invested in early childhood, crucially, invested in wraparound services. So they looked at their low-income communities, their children in poverty, and one thing they realized was, hey, a kid doesn't learn if she is hungry, if she is sick, if he's getting beaten when he goes home, if his parents are beating each other when he goes home. So they invested in those social wraparound services and healthcare services to ensure that the higher-end education that was being delivered in the classroom, because they invested most in their low-income communities first, would have a chance to take hold in their kids. Anyway, what happened with their PISA scores on math? They went up, counter to the international trend for all these nations that focused on accountability and the silly stuff that we've been pursuing in America. I'm not here to say you don't want accountability in your education system. Of course you do. Of course it has a role. It's just not a driver of turning around student achievement. And if you want more research on good drivers of turning around student achievement, please read Michael Fullen's work. It's fantastic stuff. So how do you turn things around? Number one, we at the federal level recommended that state finance had to be fixed, and we identified, a number of things that are common sense. We want the states to actually figure out what it would cost to educate their children, what sort of staffing levels they need, what demands were made, not just by special ed, but English language learners, children in poverty, et cetera, et cetera. and then adopt a finance system that actually allows you to pay for investing in education with these costs. I know it's a radical concept, this recommendation. It was really off the wall. I co-wrote the first chapter of the Each and Every Child report, and it's the finance reform thing. So I co-wrote this chapter, but the federal recommendations were mine, and we'll get to those in a second. But I think, and I want to emphasize this because you use the word equitable in education funding a lot, it doesn't mean the same for everyone. In fact, if you want equal academic outcomes for at-risk children versus non-at-risk children, and at-risk kids are generally poorer kids, and ELL, special needs, you need to spend more. And the standard multiplier that you see utilized based on what has actually worked around the country is about 1.6. Once again, Alan Odden's work. Second, the federal government needs to step in now. I mean, it's been over 40 years since the Nixon Commission issued its report. Achievement gap is still there. In fact, if you look at it from a poverty standpoint, the achievement gap is scary. For children born in 2001 that are lower income in America, depending on what state you're in, the achievement gap is 30 to 40% greater between those low-income kids and higher-income kids than the achievement gap was 25 years earlier. Same demographic. So things are not getting better. They're getting worse. So the Fed should step in and, number one, dictate that the states fix their finance systems, and number two, enact equity and excellence legislation that drives significantly enhanced federal resources into poor schools, into minority schools, into schools where there are significant achievement gaps between them that have and them that don't. Now, why is that a good thing to do? The way I look at it, it's actually pretty simple. I don't care if you were born in Connecticut or Mississippi or Illinois or Nevada. You're an American kid. And if your state and your local district isn't bothering to make the investment in public education we all know you need to be a viable member of our democracy, to be a viable asset in a modern economy, then darn it, the federal government ought to step in and make sure you get it. And the good news on this front, because I know it's been a very uplifting discussion thus far, it's really, you know, I should start off with just a picture of a sunrise, right? So there you go, there's the sunny part, and then get into the details. The good news is Congressman Honda from California actually had equity and excellence legislation drafted by his technical advisor to enforce, or I should say implement, the recommendations on federal finance reform that are in this report. And I will be flying out to D.C. tomorrow to brief the Democratic House caucus on the bill. We are looking for a Republican co-sponsor, and hopefully we'll get it introduced. These kinds of things will take years, plural, to move through the Beltway. But if it happens, it would be a radical shift in how public education is funded in America, and it would really make it a national priority. And I hope that it has an opportunity. So there is some good news there. Now let's consider, now that we talked about the national picture and just get an idea that resources matter, let's consider the great state of Illinois. Funding on K through 12 education in Illinois this year, fiscal year 2014, after you adjust for inflation, will be almost 17% less than it was in fiscal year 2000. That's a pretty big decline in real terms over time. This is our state budget. I love graphs like this loaded with numbers. I'm going to apologize to our good friends with the TV cameras and walk over here. We are planning to spend about $35 billion this year through our general fund. But before the state ever takes a vote, any legislator ever takes a vote on what to spend, $11 billion got spent off the top. These are hard costs the state has to pay. Debt service, pension contributions, something called statutory transfers out. For instance, Medicaid required transfers from the feds, or the state actually shares its income tax revenue with local governments through something called the Local Government Distributive Fund. So all that money comes off the top. The state actually allocated $50 million to repay past due bills. That's a really funny little number. And that left $25 billion for current services. And here you can see what the state spent its money on from a, discretionary standpoint. Now, my favorite line in any budget, and any of you that are taking a fiscal policy class, always look for a line called unspent appropriations. You know what that means? This is $500 million. It means the state knows it doesn't have enough money to fund these appropriations at this level. So it's going to cut them by $500 million. It's just not telling us what or when. So if you've got a line in the budget, you're a school district, you're expecting X dollars, that's a maximum possible appropriation. Once they finally get around to implementing this cut, you'll get your real money. It's a great way to budget for the state, not so much for anybody who relies on the state. So that means our net expenditures on services this year will be that smaller number at the bottom, $24 billion. Now, the problem with that is we have a pretty big deficit to cover. So here's our money to cover our expenditures this year. There are two different estimates. This is the one passed into law, and this is what the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability thinks we'll have. And the difference is about $400 million, just under. So out of that revenue, first you have to pay those hard costs, right? Your debt service, your pensions, all that other stuff. Then there's the actual deficit carry forward from last year of $7.76 billion. Those are our unpaid bills. We allocated $50 million, which was nice. Doesn't really make a rounding error dent. That means there's only $16 billion in revenue left to fund that $24 billion in services we plan on expending, meaning our deficit this year climbs, right? So the bottom line is this deficit isn't going away anytime soon, and it's a real problem because if you look at how the state spends its money over time, I would suggest these are the priorities we would write out and say the state should have. Over the last 40 years, our service budget in Illinois has spent 9 out of $10 on 4 things: education, health care, social services, public safety. That's it. So I'll throw something at you when you hear an elected official say, you know what? We should solve our budget problems with across-the-board cuts. You know why they say that? They don't want to tell you what the board is. That would be the board. So it's really unpopular to go back to your district and say, we should solve our budget problem by cutting schools, taking money away from services for the disabled and the elderly. That's not so popular. Across the board, well, that sounds responsible. You've got to understand when you're being played by politicians on this stuff. So the bottom line is that deficit is meaningful, and the health care portion of the budget can't be cut very much because most of that's Medicaid, and most of that we have to expend based on intergovernment agreements with the feds. So the bottom line is the two big parts of the general fund where that deficit's going to come to rest are education and human services, teaching our kids and caring for our vulnerable populations. So we, at my organization, remember we're bipartisan, we'd be all for spending cuts to solve this big deficit problem if, in fact, spending on services overall was a driver of our problem. The data seem to tell a different story. So we compared 2014 expenditures on those 4 core services to 2000 to see if, in fact, we're spending more or not. Now, the first bar, the blue bar, doesn't adjust for inflation or population, nothing. It's just a nominal dollar comparison, relatively meaningless. But if you look at it in nominal dollars, it does look like we're spending more, about 15% more. The middle bar adjusts for inflation using the Consumer Price Index. The second you adjust for inflation, spending on those 4 core services this year will be about 23% less, 24% less than it was in 2000. Now, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, is a really good inflation metric for the economy as a whole. Not the best for public sector spending, and here's why. The economy as a whole includes a lot of things, for instance, Clorox bleach, Pop-Tarts, et cetera, that probably the state government doesn't spend much money on. What we really spend our money on is labor. If you look at education, health, social services, and public safety, these are incredibly labor-intensive fields. And in fact, anywhere, depending on the year, 75 to 85% of our budget expenditures are the wages of the teachers and the social workers and the healthcare providers, et cetera, on the line delivering these services. So there is an inflation metric that is tied to the cost of labor over time, the Employment Cost Index. Adjusting current expenditures on those 4 core services for inflation using the ECI, we're spending almost 30% less on those 4 services this year in Illinois than we did in the year 2000. Then, I think you all know we had a temporary tax increase a few years ago. Much to do. In fact, a lot of folks have said, gee, we got this money, we keep spending more, we should give it back. The temporary tax increase did nothing. Once again, great rhetoric, it doesn't fly with reality. The green bars show you our state's deficit when you include the revenue from the temporary tax increase. Notice it stabilizes at around $8 to $9 billion a year, stabilized. Over this period of time, without adjusting for inflation, we cut spending on services by $4.7 billion. What happened was our debt service, things we borrowed in the past, kept growing every year. That's the increase in spending. It's not on services. We're paying for past sins. Kind of like what Rahm Emanuel just threw on the table, that new $900 million borrowing boondoggle that we think is a great idea. The red bars show you what our state's accumulated deficit would be if we didn't have that revenue from the temporary tax increase. In 2013, the deficit would have been $25 billion. We spent $24 billion on services. This year, the deficit would have ballooned to $32 billion. The whole budget's $35, including debt service. So for those who think Illinois could just let this temporary tax increase go off into that dark night and not suffer any consequences, remember, we have an accumulated deficit right now of $7.6 billion. You want to lose all this revenue? Then you got to cut education and social services. The reason I'm bringing the budget into a discussion on educational equity is we can't get there from here in Illinois if there is a well-funded, at least adequately funded education system, and here is our current tax policy. So you have to understand there's a really important connection between these two things. This is the fiscal cliff we're facing because that temporary tax increase does phase out over the next 2 years. So that red bar shows you what's going to happen to revenue. In fact, in 2016, just 2 years from now, even after accounting for growth in revenue from other sources, et cetera, we'll have $4 billion less in annual revenue than today. So that pushes our deficit north of $12 billion. See, I knew I shouldn't have said anything about the city. I love my country. So now, bring it back to public education. Illinois starts its education funding, and a lot of you in this audience know this. We have a bunch of people taking education finance classes from 2 brilliant university professors, and so I know that a lot of you know this stuff already. But for those of you who don't, we start our education funding in Illinois with something called the foundation level. It's a minimum amount per student to be spent on kids. Now, as I told you at the beginning, and I want to reiterate now, our foundation level, as set into law in Illinois, is based on nothing. There's absolutely not one cost of public education. It's kind of what the state thinks it can afford. And now, mind you, it doesn't pay the full foundation level because it has a school funding formula that requires property taxes to cover part of it. A few years ago, Governor Edgar decided that nothing was probably not the strongest basis for education funding. So he appointed EFAB, the Education Funding Advisory Board. And EFAB's job was to take our foundation level and actually tie it to the cost of purchasing an education that will satisfy a specific student achievement standard. Now, the standard they chose at EFAB is what would it cost in an efficiently operated school district per kid to purchase an education of sufficient quality so that we can get 2/3 of our non-at-risk children passing the state's test. This is what we're shooting for. Let me break it down a little bit. First of all, it's getting 2/3 of our non-at-risk kids passing tests, so it throws 1/3 of the kids out the window. There's that federal law, what, no child's behind is left, something like that. NCLB. To be very clear, this isn't enough to get up to those NCLB requisites of 100% of the kids passing grade level, et cetera. And number two, it's not even 2/3 of all children. It's 2/3 of our non-at-risk kids. At-risk kids, English language learners, kids from poverty, far more expensive to educate. Illinois' official policy right now is we don't care. We're not even going to figure out what it would cost to educate those kids. So now, based on this pretty tight standard, EFAB makes a recommendation. And as you can see, look at the far left-hand part of that chart. In 2003, the actual foundation level passed into law was about $120 less per child than the EFAB recommendation. Well, in the 2014 budget, the differential between that EFAB recommendation and our actual foundation level is $2,553 per child. We've run that through this Illinois State Board of Education's funding model to see what it would cost if we were just to get up to EFAB, $4.7 billion. So today in Illinois, K-12 education funding is $4.7 billion less than what it would cost to get 2/3 of our children who are not at risk passing the state standardized test. My organization has decided that's inadequate. I'm willing to listen to counterpoint, hearing none. The scarier part of this is not only do we have this inadequate starting point, but we are starting to really cheat our poor children on the poverty grant. Now, a few years ago, Illinois did something relatively rare for this state. They passed good legislation. They changed how poverty was determined for kids attending school. They went from census numbers to head counts for free and reduced out lunch, those kinds of things. Much more accurate. But it also increased the poverty grant. This graph shows you that increase. The poverty grant is that orangey, weird color at the top. And you could see that from 2008 to 2014, it increased from $780 million to $1.7 billion. So this looks like poor kids are getting a great deal. Now remember, the whole idea of the poverty grant is to be over and above your base level of funding to make up for those differences that children in poverty have to overcome in education, like maybe not having meals, et cetera, stuff at home, right? The blue bar shows you the state's actual funding of its formula general state aid through the foundation level, not including the poverty grant. Notice that beginning when this poverty grant started increasing in 2009, the foundation level started to drop year to year to year to year. In fact, the entire increase in the poverty level has been paid for by cutting general state aid to low, middle, and upper middle income kids. The net impact of this is sort of the double whammy of horrible policy. Not only aren't poor kids getting the benefit of that added investment at the top end, now All the other kids are seeing their education funding cut too. That's the reality of education funding in Illinois right now. Now, I did say like 5 or 6 or 8 times that money matters, and a lot of people don't want to believe that in education. And maybe I'll ask for a show of hands. Who has heard someone say that really it doesn't matter what you spend on a kid's education? If a kid comes from a 2-parent family with education reinforced at home, that kid will do well, and for those poor kids, forget about it. Anybody heard that sort of logic? Yeah, that logic is pervasive in the state capitol, and not just here, frankly, across America. So we thought we'd test that theory. We looked at the 5% of school districts, a statistically significant sample size, with low poverty levels, 3 to 8% poverty. And we looked at their per student expenditure on instructional finance, the money that goes right into the classroom, teacher salary, technology, course materials, et cetera. The blue dots are these school districts, right? Who woke up this morning and said, I want to talk about a regression analysis today at a tax funding? I'm always the only guy with my hand in the room. All right. The blue dots are the actual performance at a certain dollar amount of each of these school districts on the state's combined ISAT. So the north-south axis there is the ISAT score. The east-west axis at the bottom is dollars spent per kid. Notice that, and this is old data, this is 06 data, and the reason we did it in 06 is that's the year before the state reduced what the cut score was for passing. We wanted, you know, the old cut score before they tried to gin up the numbers and make their passing numbers look better. You'll notice that about $5,000 to $6,000 per kid, really there's no correlation, right? Half the school districts are performing above this best fit line, which is the expected outcome based on the performance of the group. Half of the districts are below. Then magically, at about $6,500 and above, every school district goes to at or above best fit, except one, way out here, my outlier. Now, if this was a stats class at the University of Chicago, I would have my outliers off the map. This is for public policy, so I don't want to be accused of cherry picking. So the bottom line is everybody in that school district does need fired. All right, they're spending a lot of money and they're not doing really good. But that's very rare. We sent this out for peer review, I joked, to the University of Chicago, and that was done not at our choice of professors, but the Sun-Times sent it out for peer review because they wanted to run a story on it. And the professor said, yes, this is a statistically significant correlation. So the bottom line is, even in the best communities, where you could, for the most part, very low poverty, assume 2-parent families, education reinforced at home, you still need to get to a critical amount of investment in your K-12 education system to see a statistically significant correlation with student achievement. Below that number, it's a crapshoot. Much more so the case, by the way, for lower income kids. Now, the brilliant thing about the foundation level in Illinois, $4.7 billion less than what's needed to get 2/3 of our kids passing tests, is once the state sets it, it doesn't bother to pay for it. So if you look at the far right, Illinois only covers 28% of the cost of public education from state-based resources. The national average, the blue bar, 46%, which means in Illinois, go to the far left, local resources cover 60% of the cost of public education, whereas the national average is 43%. We rank 50th in the country, dead last, in the portion of education funding covered at the state level. We rank number 1 in the nation in reliance on property taxes to fund schools. What that means is we've tied the quality of the public education a child's going to receive to the affluence of the community in which the kid lives. If a kid lives in a property wealthy community, they get a world-class education in this state. If they don't, not so very much. So that's a highly inequitable way. It is the most inequitable way to fund schools. The first person that said that was a pretty bright governor of Virginia you may have heard of a few years back. His name is Thomas Jefferson. Said that if you over-rely on local property taxes to fund schools, you'll have an inequitable system. I hear that he was a bright guy. Now, it's not just an inequitable way to fund schools. It happens to be a horrible way to tax people. So we looked at property tax growth in Illinois, took out the impact of inflation, so this is in real terms, versus growth in median income in Illinois, once again in real terms after inflation. You can see that from 1990 to 2005, property taxes grew by over 48%, median income grew by 2.7%. So you have property taxes growing by close to 20 times the rate of growth of income for most people. That's tough. Now look at what happened after the Great Recession from 2005 to 2011. Property taxes continued their inexorable rise up, median income down by 9 points. So the bottom line is, this is a very tough way to tax people, and it's an inequitable way to fund schools. But as we all know, education matters more than ever to being competitive in a global economy, and this is in a couple of ways. And so for one way, and most of you will know this, for a very long time there's been a correlation between your educational attainment and your unemployment rate. So if you look at this chart, the blue is the nation, the reddish pinkish color is the Midwest, and the yellow color is Illinois. The far left, less than high school all the way up to a BA or higher. These are unemployment rates for different levels of educational attainment. You can see less than high school, very high unemployment rates, very low unemployment rates here for people with a BA or higher. I guess the only exception there is art history majors, and no one can help them. The big change has come on wages. So now, since 1980, the only cohort of workers in Illinois and America that have actually seen their incomes increase at a rate greater than inflation, so a real growth in income, real growth in purchasing power, have a college degree. Every other worker has seen their income decline. Well, that has impacts. So let's look at here. We see the wage gap between whites and minorities in Illinois is getting worse, not better. So you look first, the wage gap between whites and Latinos grew by 46% since 1980. Now, some of that is because of discrimination. Some of it is not. Some of it is due to neutral labor market forces at play. Because with Latinos, you have a very significant immigrant population, very willing to take low-paying jobs. You have English as a second language issues, et cetera. That explains some of the growth, not all the growth in the wage gap. Then you jump down to that growth in the wage gap between whites and blacks in Illinois of 92% since 1980. As far as neutral labor market forces here, I got nothing. There's only two things happening: racism and education funding. So let's deal with the racism thing, because I know people want to believe we live in a colorblind society, but you can't hold that belief if you look at data. So we just talked about the importance of education to your employability. I'm going to pull out a couple of data sets from just before the Great Recession. If you looked at whites without a high school diploma, the hardest to employ whites, just before the Great Recession, the unemployment rate for these whites was 11.7%. Much higher than the overall unemployment rate in Illinois. The unemployment rate for blacks in Illinois before the Great Recession, who did not have a high school diploma, was 27%. Then you flip to that cohort at the very top, BA or higher. Whites who had a BA or higher, or at least 56% of them, were in the top earnings category in Illinois. Only 27% of the blacks with a BA or higher. So no matter how you slice the data and compare like kinds, you come out with racially disparate outcomes that are explainable only if discrimination is still impacting labor markets. So it is. But the other thing that's impacting these markets is the way we fund schools in Illinois. Now remember, we have tied the quality of public education a kid's going to get to the affluence of their local community, the property wealth in particular. 55% of our African American children live in the 5% of school districts in Illinois with the greatest poverty and the lowest property values. 93% of our African American children live in school districts where the concentrated poverty level is 30% or greater. What this has meant is that on average for the last 40 years, African American kids get about $1,500 less per year, K through 12, spent on their public education in Illinois than their white counterparts do. And our starting point for education funding is woefully inadequate. And then we really single out African American kids for a horribly funded education. So there's really no wonder those kids don't credential themselves on a competitive level with their white peers at higher levels, and that, of course, will show up in your wage data, and it has. So how do you fix these problems? And I hope I've made it clear that if we don't fix tax policy, we will not fix education funding policy. So there are 4 things a tax system needs to work in a modern capitalist economy. It needs to be fair to people. It needs to respond to where the economy is growing, Jesse James, Rob Banks, because that's where the money is. It needs to be stable during poor economic cycles. You can't have your revenue fall off the roof. You still need to fund your schools, et cetera. And it needs to be efficient, not distort private markets. Now, while those might be the 4 things you would look for tax policy to work, you'd have to physically leave Illinois to find any of them. We are 0 for 4. That creates this. This is our new structural deficit model. And let me explain this, because this is really, if we don't solve this, it's game over for education funding. And it's actually easy to understand. It was peer-reviewed by the University of Illinois, by the way. We start out in fiscal year 2014 assuming the state had a balanced budget, expenditures and revenues exactly equal. It didn't. As you now know, it had a $7.6 billion deficit. But, you know, you can tell from my personality, I'm kind of Pollyanna. Let's balance it. If you just adjust for inflation and population growth, you assume no changes in law, and you assume a normal economy. This is what the Congressional Budget Office does when it projects out fiscal matters into the future. Will revenues grow at the rate needed to maintain your current level of expenditures? The blue bar is our current level of expenditures and our current debt service. That assumes, by the way, the pension law that they just passed is unconstitutional. The blue bar does. If you're wondering for the impact of that pension law, if it is constitutional, it's not. But if it is, the green bar. Look at all those savings. Either way, that's our cost of maintaining current services and paying our current debt load into the future. The red bar is our current law on tax policy. Remember, there's that cliff because we're phasing out the temporary tax increase. So the revenue is going to dip. The most important thing to note about that graph is the rate of growth, the slope of our red bar, our fiscal revenue bar, is so much flatter than our cost bar. So even if the temporary tax increase was made permanent, we'd still have a structural deficit. The yellow line is our revenue if the temporary tax increase is made permanent. Notice we still have that huge deficit. So if we don't get rid of the structural deficit, the state will never have the money to invest in education needed to not only bring it up to a sufficient level, but to take off this over-reliance on local property taxes and create a more equitably funded system as well. We need more state resources. 2 places we could look for that. 1, we have to expand our sales tax base to include services. What's the base of a tax? It's just what it applies to. So if you go to the cash register and they ring something up and they include the sales tax, it's in the base. If they don't include the sales tax, it's not in the base. You want to hear a funny example on that? Shaving cream. Shaving cream's a commodity, subject to the sales tax, unless it's mentholated. Then it magically becomes a health care product, and it is not subject to our income tax. So all of you that buy shaving cream now, run out and start buying mentholated, because you get to save your state sales tax on that. There are 48 states in the nation that assess a general sales tax. Of all 48 states, we have the 47th most narrow rather than broad base. Why? We don't tax services, we do tax goods. That's a loser proposition. In 1965, the sale of goods, by the way, as a percentage of the Illinois economy is the red bar here. In 1965, the sale of goods represented 32% of the Illinois economy. That's what we tax. Sale of services represented 36%. By 2012, you can see services grew to be 73% of our economy. Goods dropped to 17%. To be clear, that is what we are taxing. That is what we're leaving out. Any questions why that dog won't hunt? Right? We absolutely have to expand the sales tax base to include services, and this will not make us Taxachusetts. All of our neighboring states already tax services far more than we do. Missouri and Indiana tax somewhere between 25 and 50% of the services we think you should be taxing. Iowa and Wisconsin, they tax all of them, more in some cases than what we think you should tax. I don't know about you, but I have not seen busloads of people from Iowa and Wisconsin coming here to get their hair cut. Have you seen that? Because they tax haircuts as a service in those states. Now, if you've seen their haircuts, you should encourage them to come, because they're not good. But the bottom line is, it won't hurt us economically. It'll allow us to raise revenue we need to balance our budget and invest in education. And then there's fair taxation and responsive taxation. And I don't like to read from my PowerPoints. I mean, these are pretty much cue cards for me to go off and talk. I'm going to read this quote. It's straight out of The Wealth of Nations. You all know The Wealth of Nations? The book written by Adam Smith in 1776. That's right, 1776, an important year in this country for some reason or another. Written in 1776, that set forth the basis of capitalism. Adam said, the subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Home Lord Keynes has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. That is not Karl Marx. That is not Groucho Marx. It's no Marxist. It's Adam frigging Smith. Now, Adam had a reason for that. He said in a capitalist economy, economic growth will always disproportionately advantage top income classes over the bottom and middle due to bargaining power or a number of other things. That's not evil or immoral, but it's how the system's going to work. So if people at the top are always going to get a disproportionate benefit, they should have the greatest tax burden as a percentage of income to pay for the government that will line their pockets. Interesting theory, was Adam right? This is share in income growth in America adjusted for inflation from 1947 to 1979 as reported by Americans to the Internal Revenue Service. It's from tax code data. See, during that sequence, after inflation, the wealthiest 10% got 34% of all growth in income in America, whereas the bottom 90% got only 65%. Now, this was actually a good time. When a rising tide was lifting all boats, we were building a middle class, there was real growth in income at the bottom and middle. Different story, really, from 1979 through 2011. Over that sequence, the wealthiest 10% in America got 139.8% of all income growth after inflation. Think about that number. All of it is 100%. So more than all of the growth in America's economy went to the wealthiest 10%. Meaning on average, and of course different people fare differently, this is all on average, the bottom 90% had lower incomes after inflation in 2011 than they did in 1979. So to be fair, you'd want to focus your taxes at the top, where people are paying it out of their growing wealth, rather than at the bottom and middle, where now people would be paying taxes out of their growing poverty. Illinois doesn't do that. We have right now the second most regressive taxing system in the nation. We focus our taxes on the bottom 80%, and we really give a free rein to the top. In fact, everybody in the bottom 80% in Illinois pays more than 10% of their income in state and local taxes. The bottom 20% pay almost 14% of their income. The wealthiest 1% pay 4% of their income. In a perfect world, the way you'd fix that is go to a fair tax structure on your income tax with lower rates for lower levels of income and higher rates for higher levels of income. But you, me, right now, we don't live in a perfect world. We live in Illinois. And Illinois has a constitution that requires a flat income tax across all levels. So you need a constitutional amendment to fix that. If we did, and all the arguments against increasing taxes, in particular against going to a fair tax structure with a graduated rate system, are that you'd ruin your economy. It's great rhetoric, but it flies in the face of reality. So I'm going to leave you with this slide. The Institute on Tax and Economic Policy analyzed economic growth between two groups of states. 41 states in America have an income tax. 9 have no income tax at all. Texas, Florida, North Dakota, Alaska, etc. They looked at the 9 states in America that have the highest rates on their graduated rate system and compared their economic growth over the last decade to the 9 states in America with no income tax whatsoever. They looked at unemployment rate, change in median income, and growth in per capita state gross product. What they found, the high tax states averaged 6.1% unemployment per year during that 10-year sequence. The no tax states, 6%. The high tax states lost 4.2% in median income over this sequence. We had the Great Recession. The no tax states lost slightly more, 4.5%, worse. Growth in per capita state GDP, the high tax states did significantly better, 8.2% growth to 5.2. What this does and doesn't do. This slide does not prove you can tax yourself to prosperity. But what it does disprove is simply going to a graduated tax system or being somewhat higher taxed than other states makes you less competitive economically. There are simply no compelling data sets to support that argument. So to end this, Illinois has the 5th largest economy of any state in America, over $695 billion a year state GDP. It's not only the 5th largest economy of any state. If Illinois were an independent country, that would be the 20th largest economy in the entire world. Bigger than Ireland, Norway, Greece, Colombia, Nigeria. You may have heard of a couple of those places. For decades, Illinois has denied an adequate education to the vast majority of its school children and has set up a structurally racist system of education finance that specifically singles out African Americans and Latinos for very poorly funded education. To fix that, we need to raise taxes the right way. If we raised about $4.5 billion, and that's not a small number, $4.5 billion, in new tax revenue, in a couple of years, we'd actually be able to pay off our past due bills at the state level, and in about 4 or 5 years, we'd be able to fund education to the EFAB recommendation or above. That tax increase represents less than 1% of our economic activity in our $695 billion economy. And that is standing in the way of doing the right thing. We, as thoughtful citizens, ought not accept our politicians' lack of political will to fix this problem. I appreciate you listening, and I think I should, do you want me to take questions, Diane? Do you want to bring her up first? Okay, so Carolyn first. Well, let me get
So we're going to take questions, and there's a mic there, and if people will come up to the mic to ask their questions or make comments, and while they're doing that, I'm going to introduce you to Carolyn Balicki. Carolyn is a parent of 2 kids in the Chicago public school system, and she's going to talk just for a couple of minutes about how this crisis in funding affects Chicago public schools, and also as a parent activist with a group called Raise Your Hand, which some of you may have heard about, is going to talk about what parents are doing to deal with the situation that Mr. Martire has talked about.
Thank you, Diane. My name's Caroline Balicki, and I actually have 3 kids in the Chicago Public Schools. I wanted to actually bring my oldest here. He's in 5th grade because he didn't want to come because he's tired of these things and me going to them. But I did want to bring him because he doesn't have art this year. He's in 5th grade, and while he does have music, and he's extremely fortunate that he has technology and PE one each day. Not every day like I had when I was a kid, but once each day in the Chicago Public Schools. He does not have art, and he's mad about it. Just sort of to illustrate the kinds of cuts that are happening in CPS, and that's a relatively minor cut, relatively speaking, across the board. As Diane mentioned, I'm with Raise Your Hand, and we're a parent advocacy group, and we have done a lot of analysis into the kinds of budget cuts and the general themes and trends that are happening in CPS. As Ralph mentioned, there is a growing structural deficit in the Chicago Public Schools. This year, they cut $100 million to students, and many schools don't have art, music. The core amount per pupil is entirely inadequate. It's something like $4,400 per elementary student, which our school, my kids attend Disney 2 magnet school, and our school was under student-based budgeting last year. And last year, we got something like $6,200 per student. Now we're getting $4,400 per student, which is probably why my 5th grader doesn't have art, among other things. Some of the cuts that we've documented, there were 180 arts positions cut. And before the cuts, only 40% of students had art and music. 79 librarians were cut. There were 90 high school English teachers cut, 80 PE teachers cut, 2,500 teachers and staff across CPS. In addition to this, CPS students face overcrowded classrooms, something like 37 kids in a room. And, compared to I assume some of you are students of history in the Chicago Public Schools, so you know that in the 80s they had something like 39 kids in a classroom. So it's not as bad as then, but it's still not adequate by a long shot. And they're in decrepit facilities with aging infrastructure, and by infrastructure, I mean electricity to power all the PCs on which the kids must take the NWEA test 3 times a year. And other standardized tests, and then they don't have wireless or they don't have bandwidth. So these are all sort of infrastructure problems that CPS just cannot handle, in addition to the labor costs that Ralph mentioned. In addition to these across-the-board cuts, there's the ongoing problem of inequity across the district and within schools. As I mentioned, my children's school doesn't have, they do have art, but my 5th grader doesn't have art. But, my 5th grader has art, but my 1st grader doesn't have art, but my 1st grader has art. And there are schools right around us that don't have art at all, or music at all, or technology, or gym, and they're doing gym in the hallways or on the playground. It's just inadequate. So children do not have the basic well-rounded educational day that they need to become, as Ralph said, productive, upwardly mobile, competitive members of Chicago and society at large. So where does that get us? How do we solve this? I don't know how we can solve this, but I'm here to sort of speak about, I have 5 action items that you guys can all take if you're interested in trying to improve and advocate in Springfield for a graduated rate income tax. So here are my 5 things. The first thing you can do is sign a petition, and I have one that I can pass around. Sorry, is that? The next thing you can do is ask your alderman to sign the petition or endorse the campaign. There's a campaign that's being run by A Better Illinois. I'm sorry, I'm not really used to speaking in public, so I apologize in advance for being, or in the middle for being somewhat disjointed. I really don't want to see this on YouTube. But anyway, so I've been working with, Raise Your Hand has been working with A Better Illinois, which is a large campaign to get a graduated rate income tax passed in Springfield. And of course, as Ralph mentioned, we have to first change the Constitution, amend the Constitution. So there is a movement around that. And the first thing that you can do is sign this petition that's going around. The next thing you can do is ask your alderman to endorse the campaign or sign the petition. And if your alderman already has, you can thank him or her. Currently, there are 21 out of the 50 aldermen in the city of Chicago who have signed up. If you're at all interested in finding out if your alderman has, I have a sheet here that shows which ones have. The next thing you can do is ask your legislator to endorse the campaign or co-sponsor. There's currently a bill, House Joint Resolution Committee Amendment 33 and Senate Joint Resolution Committee Amendment 40. Or you can ask or if your legislator has signed on to that, you can thank him or her for doing that. And if you're not sure who your legislator is, you can find it on the ISBE website at http://www.elections.il.gov. And it will tell you who your U.S. congressional district, your state Senate district, and your state representative district. So you should all know that if you don't already. The next thing you can do, number 4, is ask your friends and family to endorse the campaign. The thing that's going around now, I sat on the playground and passed it out to all of my friends and asked them to sign. If they don't want to sign, they just say no. And there's information on there too. And then the final thing that you can do is you can participate in a day of action with A Better Illinois. They have various kickoff events going on. You can find out more about them at abetterillinois.org. And in addition to that, they are working with Raise Your Hand to plan a day of action in Springfield on the 29th of April. If you're at all interested in that, I can take your information and contact you closer to the event. And that's it. Thanks.
Questions? No? Great, thanks.
Oh, Ralph, the place to sign up for the petition is also on the back of the handout,
Yeah,
the website.
go ahead.
Hello, I just want to say, first of all, thank you for coming out. I've learned a lot tonight. My name is Adam Heenan. I'm a teacher on the Southwest Side. And my question is partly twofold. The first has to do with what I heard when you came in, which was you're presenting something to the House Democrats. I'm kind of wondering if you're expecting any pushback from the Department of Education on what you're going to be proposing. And my second question is a little bit about administrative level. So I'm from Kankakee, Illinois. And when I was my first teaching job, I had one principal and one superintendent. And I'm in Chicago, and I have so many more administrators telling me what to do in my classroom. And I'm wondering, what are the costs around the states where we see how many administrators there are?
Yeah, so to
per
answer your
district?
second question, Illinois education is actually very efficiently operated from an administrative cost standpoint. The variable somewhere between 4.5% to 7% a year of total educational expenses, which is nothing. I mean, if you're going to run a Fortune 5 company, et cetera, which before I did this, I was a corporate lawyer during mergers and acquisitions and stuff, and I could tell you an efficiently operated business in the private sector is 12 to 15 points on administrative costs. So it's highly efficiently operated. I can't get into the specifics of Kankakee because I don't have any data to base it on, and so I'm not going to.
But in CPS, there seems like there's so many more.
Once again, you know, we did an analysis of the CPS budget this year for the first time, and it's an incomplete analysis because the reporting is something less than transparent. And that's all I will say on that. On pushback from the administration or the Department of Education at the federal level, I would hope not, because we are implementing, in fact, the recommendations that are in our For Each and Every Child report that we as commissioners under the Department of Education voted unanimously to pass. So hopefully the Department of Education will not be adverse to this. I did in Congressman Honda's district in California about 6 months ago, we did a presentation on the commission's findings, and Arnie Duncan was there from the Department of Education, and he flat out said that the one area the administration feels like they haven't done a good enough job is on equity and excellence in education funding. So that was a positive thing for him to say. I mean, it's really hard for an administration official to get up in front of reporters and say something like that. So I think that they are very open to a more equitable funding system.
Good evening, sir. My name is Troy LaRaviere. I'm the principal of Blaine Elementary School. It's on Southport and Grace in Wrigleyville. I made a few public statements this summer regarding the CPS budget that were critical of CPS, critical of our political leadership, particularly our mayor. And they centered on three things, and I was wondering if you could shed some light on any one of these three things. One was the public response of the mayor in terms of passing the buck to Springfield and blaming it on teacher pensions. You know, and my statement was that inaction in Springfield is no excuse for inaction in Chicago.
Well, let me answer that
Yeah.
first, because that's going to take more than a second. So, number one, public employee pensions and the benefit levels under those pensions in Illinois are not the problem. They are eminently affordable. They are rational. The problem is for 45 to 65 years, the state just didn't bother to put in the normal cost to fund them. So instead of actually funding the pensions like they should have, they took the money they should have put in the pensions and used it for schools or whatever because they had that structural deficit. So no elected official should be able to blame the pensions for any portion of the fiscal crisis. The fiscal crisis exists at the state and local level for two reasons. Inadequate tax policy, which encouraged irresponsible fiscal practices of underfunding pensions, and now they're paying for that irresponsible fiscal practice by covering a ramp. But second, in particular, the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. By law, those things have been underfunded for the last 8 years. They took a number of holidays and stuff. When CPS got control of the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund from the state, middle 90s, I'm going to forget the exact year, I think it was 95 or 90, was it 95? 95. They were 100% funded, 98% funded. There was no crisis. And then what the city did was very much what the state did. They intentionally engaged in a practice of underfunding. And now they're looking to get out of their obligations because they've created such a nightmare. Where it's okay for the mayor to blame the state of Illinois is on the overall education funding picture. It's set way too low, and it's way over reliant on property taxes, and that is driven from the state down to the city.
And so part two of that is So if that's not it, and whether the state does what it's supposed to do or not, what can you do as the mayor of Chicago, whether or not the state does what it needs to or not? You have access to funds. And so there's this idea of siphoning off TIF funds that are supposed to go to schools and parks and using it.
There's not as much money there as you would think. And so
Yes.
what would be available is obviously only the percentage allocation that goes to the particular taxing authority, in this case, the schools, right?
Right.
As opposed to the park district or whatever, and only for what's non-committed. And the non-committed portion of the TIF money that's sitting in the city of Chicago would not result in a significant boon to schools. I think the number that I most recently saw, and all this is estimated work, is around $170 million. And while certainly you wouldn't turn your back on $170 million, it would have plugged the budget hole this year. It's a one-time revenue, and then you still have the holes ongoing. It's certainly no panacea. So I think the TIF thing is way overplayed. And I think bigger picture, you really do have to look to the state, because local level resources, or revenue sources, I should say, just aren't as broad-based or as easily accessible as what the state has. So the state has the income tax and the sales tax, and those should be the two big revenue drivers. City of Chicago, really, the property tax, and then a bunch of little tiny excise taxes, its portion of the sales tax. It has far fewer options for bringing in revenue, and most of them are pretty regressive, and most of them would, if it's an excise tax, would lose their value over time. What does that mean? So an excise tax is like a cigarette tax. So it's a per unit charge. So let's say $1 per pack of cigarettes. So if you raise it to $1.50 per pack next year, that's great, but the year after that, it's still $1.50 per pack. So after inflation in real terms, it's worth $1.47, right? And the year after that, it's still $1.50 per pack. But after inflation, it's now worth about $1.42. So over time, in real terms, these excise taxes contribute to the structural deficit. It's a poor way to finance the public sector. And unfortunately, the local governments rely significantly more on these excise type taxes than does the state. So to get a comprehensive solution, we have to focus at the state level.
Third and last is the apparent lack of transparency with which CPS discusses the budget. Last year, there was sort of this figure given, and after there was sort of this public outcry and about the budget, all of a sudden $10 million more appeared out of nowhere and was allocated amongst the schools. And people are wondering, like, what is the actual level of funding available to CPS? Where is this money? Where did that money come from? And how do we find out what is really available for school
Got
funding?
nothing for you. And let me be very clear about that. So we tried to analyze, for instance, pension contributions made by CPS over the last 10 years, right? We're looking for trends. Some years, they report their contribution and the employee contribution and the healthcare contribution, which then you have to figure out where to. Some years they only report their contribution. Some years they only report their contribution and the healthcare, but not the employee. Some year they report theirs, the employee, but not the healthcare. There's not even consistency in how they report it from year to year, much less in how they account for it. So we tried to lay a couple of their different budgets over each other, their operation budget, to try to see if we could make them balance, and we could not. So it's just not transparent, and short of us devoting our entire staff time to FOIA requests that would be obfuscated for decades, I mean, I don't have a quick answer. We need to clean up the transparency of the reporting.
Thank you, sir.
Is that it? Very good. Thanks. Oh, no?
I just wanted to ask a question, because I feel like what you said was so true, but then we're faced with now the Speaker of the House proposing more tax cuts.
Yeah, that won't work.
Yeah. So what should we, how viable is this graduated tax, and what should we be doing?
Well, it's
to
not
help?
viable if people don't get behind it and support it. I mean, this is the kind of thing where, You know, and there are a lot of excellent legislators, so let me just call out a couple that I know are bold and brave, so this doesn't sound like I'm slamming everybody in Springfield. Like Toy Hutchinson, Chair of Senate Revenue. She will take very brave stands. She will go out on a limb. John Sullivan, a downstate senator, has done a similar thing in a very difficult district where he has Tea Party candidates running against him, et cetera. But for the most part, elected officials do not really lead on these sorts of controversial issues. They follow. They follow the polls and they follow their constituents. And so if you are not actively engaged with your elected officials, they will not do the bold thing, even if they think it's the right thing, because they're afraid you're going to vote them out of office. And that fear isn't just out of self-interest. I don't know anyone that ran for public office to fix tax policy. You know, they all ran for a different reason. And now they've got to deal with tax policy. But if they get voted out of office over taxes, they can't fix what they actually ran to do. So it's a hard issue for elected officials, particularly those that are unwilling to lead. They do need to hear from their constituents. They need to hear from you regularly, or it won't change. I'll just be honest with you. Bless you. At this juncture, it's really important that you get engaged.
And I don't know if, but a while back when they first got into lottery and all that stuff, funding from that was supposed to go to education.
It did, okay, so let me, it's not a forum if I don't get the lottery question. 98% of the money from the lottery, net proceeds after paying off the cost of, running the lottery, have always gone to education, always. The problem is we have that structural deficit, right? Not enough revenue every year, costs going up. So instead of enhancing school funding, it became replacement revenue. So for every dollar that came in from the lottery, a dollar that used to go in from sales or income taxes came out and went to health care or went to human services. You see where 9 out of 10 dollars get spent: education, health, human services, public safety. So the bottom line is the lottery has always funded schools, but it was a shell game, and it became replacement rather than enhancement revenue.
What about corporate welfare, the EDGE program? How much does that contribute to the problem?
Not much. And so and we don't like these charged things like corporate welfare. You can call it, well, we call these things tax expenditures. Why do we call them that? Because you're spending money through the tax code as opposed to a direct expenditure, and you're spending it to create a public good. And so think about it. In a tax expenditure situation, a business that would have to pay a tax to the state that the state could then collect and use to fund schools, that business gets to keep. And instead, that business is supposed to keep it and create jobs. Another public good. Jobs, a good thing. The problem with tax expenditures as opposed to direct expenditures is they're not very accountable. We don't monitor them very well. So we don't know if we're getting the benefit of our investment for the most part. And some of the EDGE credits have been fine, and some have been horrible deals for the state. And so the state does need the capacity to claw some of those back. But I think the total amount of tax expenditures for businesses is roughly about the $1.5, $1.7 billion range. And a number of those tax expenditures are actually ones you want. For instance, there's a tax expenditure for the purchase of large manufacturing equipment. So when they buy that equipment, they don't pay a sales tax on it. Well, they shouldn't, because that's not an end use of that equipment. When they manufacture the product and then it gets sold, then you tax that transaction. So there's a number of tax expenditures on the books for businesses that work that are very good tax policy. Now let's get to what the speaker just proposed. So the speaker just proposed cutting the corporate income tax rate from its current level of 7% down to 3% or something like that to stimulate job growth. Won't happen, won't work, bad policy. Why is that? If you look at the taxes businesses pay in Illinois, 40% of those taxes are property taxes. The corporate income tax is only 7.3% of the taxes businesses pay. Number two, very few businesses pay them. 92% of all businesses in Illinois paid $5,000 or less in corporate income taxes. 74% paid nothing. Flip it, only 5% of the corporations in Illinois paid $10,000 or more in corporate income taxes. So this is going to impact very few businesses, and it certainly is not going to create any incentive to hire more people. Why would that be? Since the Great Recession ended, corporate profits after inflation are up by over 35%. GDP growth is 8%, wages are up 5%. So corporate profits right now as a percentage of national GDP are at their highest level ever, and we're not creating jobs. It's been a jobless recovery. The whole idea of tax relief for a business is they keep more of their profit, and that'll encourage them to create a job. They got a ton of profit right now, and they're not creating jobs. In fact, we've had woeful job growth. So there's no rational basis to believe letting them keep even more of their profit in this environment will stimulate hiring. Next. Tax breaks don't stimulate hiring, period, ever, never. Why? Who found that? The Congressional Budget Office recently did a study of the interplay of tax policy at the federal level and stimulating the economy and growth. And interestingly, they found that federal tax policy played no role. They did find something that actually encouraged businesses to hire more people, though. Folks buying more of that business's products or services. Amazingly, when demand for what the business produced went up, the business hired more people. So the bottom line is this tax policy discussion frequently misses the boat. The idea of an EDGE credit is to stimulate economic growth in an area that normally wouldn't have economic growth. Now, the EDGE credits have been abused just like everything else, and a certain number of them should certainly be done away with. But it's okay to have on the books tax incentive programs for blighted communities if, in fact, they are working, and you can show that they are working. But overall, there's no statistically significant correlation between tax policy and economic growth.
My question is there still conversation at the state to shift the pension liability to individual districts?
Yep.
Can you expand on that for us? Because that's our property taxes going up. There's no other way.
All right, so you're all familiar with the Affordable Care Act, or as I like to call it, Romney Care, because it's basically the Massachusetts program done up on the federal level. I don't know why Republicans hate it so much. It's a Republican program, but whatever. Part of Romney Care is an expansion of health care to people that don't have it, and the feds pay 100% of that expansion. However, as that expansion, as a condition of that expansion, a state has to enroll all the individuals that would have been eligible for Medicaid under the old rules pre-Affordable Care Act at the normal matching rates, which in Illinois are only 50%. So what does that mean? We've got about 300,000 or so people who qualify under the old rules that the state now has to enroll at the old matching rates, which means it's going to cost about $1.1 or $1.2 billion. Why am I telling you this? Devolving the responsibility for funding the normal cost of the teachers' pensions from the state to the local governments will save the state about $1.2 billion. To cover this Medicaid cost. And that's the insider game on that. Will it happen? I don't know, but I do know that it has strong support among leadership.
Could you talk about any efforts to shift to a services tax system?
Yeah, interestingly, a colleague of mine at the center, Jennifer, and I have gone around the state to talk with conservative and more liberal elected officials. I mean, we have a bipartisan group. We really think that this is a bipartisan solution, that the data is something that should appeal to if you're conservative or liberal, because the data are the data, and what works is what works. And I would have to say elected officials are very open-minded to it. And I think given this fiscal cliff that we're confronting in just a few years, and it's going to be significant in 2016, I mean, losing $4 billion in revenue when your accumulated deficit's already almost $8 billion is not bearable, right? The fiscal system can't handle that. So they're looking for reasonable options, and I think most people recognize our sales tax just isn't broad enough. So the good news is an appropriate expansion of that could generate anywhere, depending on what they do for the base, 1.5 to 3.2 billion in new revenue. It gets you a long way towards where you go. And then local governments would benefit too, because they piggyback on the state sales tax. So that would create a boon for the city of Chicago, the county of Cook, other municipalities across the state. The flip side of that, of course, is sales taxes are always slightly regressive, right? So they take a bigger bite out of a lower middle-income family's pocket than they do a more affluent family's pocket. So you need to balance it from a tax policy standpoint by going to this fairer income tax with lower rates at lower levels of income and higher rates at higher. So we kind of need to do both. And now I'm going to say something that, you know, is controversial. My organization is very committed to fair taxation. It's part of our mission. But if you have a choice between a regressive tax and a spending cut, from an economic standpoint, the regressive tax is better for the low-income person every single time. Even if it takes $50 or $75 out of a low-income family's budget for a year, that's a lot of money. That's literally going to hurt a low-income family. What if they lose their child care? Well, that's a $6,000 or $7,000 economic hit to the low-income family. So the trade-off between service cuts, which are always focused on the poor, right, or a regressive tax, if you have no other choice, I mean, you have to go for the regressive tax as the lesser of the two evils.
Could you talk a little bit about the tie between school finance reform and educational reform, and how those two things need to work together or maybe are opposed to one another?
No, I think they have to go together because, I mean, you have a lot of that rhetoric out there, right, that you've seen that, you know, the funding, don't throw money down a black hole, the education system doesn't work, we spent more, you know, all those arguments. And so you certainly would want to couple your education funding reforms with moving to an evidence-based model for school finance. Now, Illinois is actually, there's good news there. Senator Andy Minorities from Central Illinois ran a legislative task force in the Senate that looked at the state school funding formula, and they just made their recommended report to the governor, et cetera, et cetera. And in it, they say, you know, it's time to get up to the EFAB standard, and it is time to collapse our silly foundation level into one big formula that is got weighted averages for ELL and poverty, and it's moving to an evidence-based model. They didn't quite endorse a full evidence-based model, but it's moving that way, so that's positive, and I think you need to do that because you need to tell people that question whether or not you get more bang. Well, no, what we are financing is actually those practices that have a correlation to enhancing student achievement over time. So I think that's how you win the game ultimately, and we certainly do need to do it. That's a great point.
Hi, one question. What portion of the educational funding is actually social services? That is, if you look at some of the PISA countries, they actually have lower per capita, per student spending than the United States does at the national level, not necessarily at the state level. But I've always been unclear, but those countries also have extensive social services that may be separately budgeted. So I've sort of looked at what degree we force our education system to fund the social services that should otherwise be provided through the social welfare budget. And then, I don't know if you know the date on that. And then secondly, is the fundamental problem in this state that the state's been cheap? That is, people just don't want to be taxed in this state. And then what is the mechanism? Because it seems that we have a very low tax, the state level spending for education is low. To what degree is there a risk that the property taxes will then be cut in jurisdictions that have higher property taxes, thereby offsetting the increased income taxes? Is there fear of that, or is that unlikely to happen?
Yeah, well, I think what you'll see is instead of, on the last question first, instead of out-and-out cuts in property taxes, what you'll see is a flattening in growth over time, which you want. I think what you'll see is, as the state steps to the plate and pays for more and more, it takes the pressure off the property tax, particularly in lower and middle income communities, and that'll happen. I don't think in an affluent community, the state funding is going to matter that much anyway. I know at River Forest, we fund 83% of our budget from local resources. We don't really pay much attention to what the state does. We factor in all the goofy decisions that they could make and budget accordingly going forward. Most school districts don't have that flexibility with their base. So in more affluent communities, there will be no impact. I think in middle income and lower income communities, you will see a flattening, and that's good. You want that to flatten. You want the state to pay significantly more of that school funding. All right, what else did you ask? You asked the question about what?
Social services.
Social service, not a big part of the school funding budget. I mean, it flows through separate budgets in Illinois. Comparing OECD expenditures nation to nation, you have to be somewhat careful because our education funding costs do include retirement and health care benefits. No other industrialized nation does in their education system. So what you get in those nations are pure education numbers, whereas ours has both pension and health care added in. So that artificially inflates the American investment in education versus other industrialized OECD nations. So you have to be a little careful with those data sets.
Since elected officials are sometimes more motivated by campaign contributions, both at the local and federal level, than they are by public petitions, unfortunately, are there some PACs for locally funded organizations that are supporting these efforts?
Not so very much. There's a lot of PACs opposing. Koch brothers have a long reach. That's the answer. You can make a fully tax-deductible contribution to the 501c3 Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, however. And we'd be more than happy to accept a check.
Any other questions? Oh, there's a question.
Good evening. Question. When I tend things like this dealing with education finance, no one ever talks about, and I probably already know why, but just curious, a financial transaction tax. I know there are 2 bills in Springfield that have been buried so far that that you can't find them. But I think one was Derek Smith, the other one was Mary Flowers, and her bill she'd asked for a penny, which would raise about $80 billion. So why? Comment on that, because I'm pretty sure why that.
Yeah, real simple. So financial transaction tax is, and for those who don't know, so these big stock trades and whatever they go back and forth, you assess a little tax on the trade. No big deal. No state assesses one. None, zero, not a zilch. New York kind of does, but they refund the whole thing back. So it's not a real tax. They just take it out and give it back. Illinois has never been a tax outlier on being high tax except in one area, and that's the property tax. And the only reason we're high tax there is because the state is so low tax and local districts have decided, gee, they want their school doors to open. So they've gone after the local property tax. I can't imagine a political scenario where a financial transaction tax would gain momentum in Springfield. And if you think about it, didn't the CME just get a $100 million tax break from the state of Illinois? This is Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And so if you think about that, the last year, according to their own reporting, their net profits were $900 million. So we, with this tax incentive, gave them $1 billion, got them over the $1 billion mark in net profit. I can't imagine the politics of that. Now, I think the federal government should do it. And I think at the federal government, it's got a rational chance to happen. I think if you really want to devote a lot of time and energy to pushing for tax reform, you ought to focus on the 2 basic taxes, the income and sales, that are so horribly designed, and that there's a reasonable political likelihood of modifying. That's my honest answer. I mean, it could be. Others have different opinions. Okay, thank you very much.